Tonight we'll explore some of the most compelling UFO encounters ever documented, stories that have puzzled investigators for decades and continue to defy explanation. These aren't just tales of lights in the sky, but detailed accounts from credible witnesses whose lives were forever changed by what they experienced. What if the boundaries between our world and something far stranger are thinner than we imagine? What if, in the quiet moments between sleep and waking, we might glimpse truths that daylight cannot reveal? So settle into comfort, let your breathing slow, and prepare to drift through mysteries that span decades and continents. Each story we'll explore tonight is drawn from official records, witness testimonies, and investigations that revealed far more questions than answers. Let the gentle rhythm of these encounters guide you toward peaceful rest as we venture together into the unknown. The Kelly-Hopkinsville Siege. The summer evening of August 21st, 1955, settled over the Sutton farmhouse like a warm blanket. 12 people were gathered in the modest Kentucky home, 5 adults and 7 children, their voices mixing with the gentle chorus of crickets and katydids that filled the rural darkness. It was the kind of peaceful Sunday night that made you grateful for simple pleasures: family around you, a roof overhead, and the promise of another quiet week ahead in the rolling hills of Christian County. Billy Ray Taylor stepped outside around 7 o'clock, heading toward the well to fetch water for the evening. The air hung still and humid, heavy with the scent of honeysuckle and freshly cut hay from the neighboring fields. As he worked the old pump handle, drawing cool water from deep in the earth, something caught his eye in the darkening sky above. A brilliant streak of light was cutting across the heavens, moving with a purposeful speed that didn't match any falling star or airplane he'd ever seen. This light moved with intention, tracing a graceful arc through the twilight before disappearing behind the tree line toward the gully that bordered the Sutton property. Billy Ray watched until the light vanished completely, then shrugged and continued with his task. Probably just a meteor, he told himself, though something about its controlled movement nagged at the back of his mind. The way it had seemed to choose its path, to deliberately head toward that particular spot in the woods. He returned to the house with the water and mentioned what he'd seen to the others gathered in the sitting room. The family listened politely but paid little attention. Strange lights in the Kentucky sky weren't particularly uncommon, and they had more immediate concerns. The children needed baths, the adults wanted to catch up on the day's events, and everyone was looking forward to the peaceful end of another weekend. But, an hour later, as the last traces of daylight faded and full darkness claimed the countryside, their quiet evening would shatter like glass against stone. It began with the dogs. The family's hunting hounds, normally calm and well-behaved creatures who had spent their lives in these hills, suddenly erupted into frantic barking. But this wasn't the excited yelping they made when chasing rabbits through the underbrush or greeting visitors coming up the lane. This was something else entirely. This was pure, primal terror that made their voices crack and their bodies tremble as they cowered against the porch. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the barking stopped. The dogs fell completely silent, and that silence was somehow more disturbing than their terrified cries had been. It was as if something had either frightened them beyond the ability to make sound or removed them from the equation entirely. Lucky Sutton, the head of the household, grabbed his shotgun from its familiar place by the door. Billy Ray took up the .22 rifle, and together they moved cautiously toward the back of the house. The night air that had seemed so peaceful moments before now felt charged with an electric tension that made the hair on their arms stand up. As Lucky slowly opened the back door and peered into the darkness beyond their small circle of porch light, his blood turned to ice in his veins. There, not 20 feet from their back steps, stood something that belonged in the realm of nightmares, rather than the familiar landscape of rural Kentucky. It was small in stature, perhaps 3 feet tall, but its presence seemed to fill the entire yard with an aura of menace that pressed against them like a physical weight. The creature's oversized head bobbed on a thin neck that seemed barely capable of supporting it. Enormous yellow eyes glowed like twin lanterns in the darkness, burning with an intelligence that was unmistakably alien, yet disturbingly focused on the house and its occupants. Its ears were pointed and bat-like, twitching as if listening to sounds beyond human perception, and its arms hung nearly to the ground, ending in clawed hands that seemed to reach toward the house with deliberate predatory intent. Lucky raised his shotgun with hands that trembled only slightly. He was a man accustomed to hunting, to facing down dangerous animals in these woods, and fired. The blast echoed across the quiet farmland like thunder, and the creature flipped backward as if struck by an invisible force. But instead of falling wounded or dead as any earthly animal would, it scrambled to its feet on those spindly legs and disappeared into the darkness with impossible speed. But this was only the beginning. Instead of retreating as any sensible creature would after being shot, it seemed to be circling the house, and within minutes another figure appeared at the kitchen window. This one pressed its grotesque face against the glass, those terrible yellow eyes peering directly into the warmth and light of their family home, studying them with the cold curiosity of a scientist examining insects in a jar. One of the children screamed, a sound that cut through the night air like a blade. Billy Ray took careful aim with his rifle and fired through the screen, watching as the creature tumbled away from the window. But like its companion, it seemed completely unharmed, merely inconvenienced, as if their bullets were nothing more than annoying pebbles thrown by children. What followed over the next 4 hours was unlike anything in the recorded annals of American paranormal history. The Sutton farmhouse found itself under siege by multiple creatures that seemed not only immune to conventional weapons but possessed of an almost playful malevolence, as if they were enjoying some cosmic game at the family's expense. They appeared at windows with regularity, their glowing eyes and grotesque faces pressing against the glass before vanishing the moment a gun was aimed in their direction. They scurried across the roof with scratching sounds that sent chills down everyone's spine, their claws clicking against the tin with the rhythm of skeletal fingers drumming impatiently. They dropped from the old oak trees that surrounded the house like enormous predatory cats, their phosphorescent bodies glowing faintly in the darkness. The family huddled together in the main room, the children clinging to their mothers while the men took turns standing guard at the windows. Every few minutes, another creature would appear at a different location, and one of the men would fire, watching in growing frustration and terror as their shots seemed to pass right through the beings or knock them down only momentarily before they sprang back up and disappeared into the night. The ammunition was precious. They hadn't been expecting a siege after all, but the creatures seemed endless. No sooner would they drive one away from the kitchen window than another would appear on the roof, or at the front door, or materializing from the shadows near the well where Billy Ray had first seen that strange light in the sky. One particularly unnerving encounter occurred when Lucky spotted a creature perched on the roof like some demonic gargoyle, its form silhouetted against the star-filled sky. He stepped out onto the porch to get a clearer shot, raising his shotgun toward the figure above. As he took aim, a clawed hand reached down from the low eaves directly above him and lightly touched his hair. The contact sent electric shock waves of terror through his entire body. Lucky dove back inside, slamming the door behind him with such force that the whole house shook, his heart pounding so violently that the others could hear it from across the room. The casual nature of that touch, the way the creature had reached out almost playfully, suggested an intelligence that was not only alien but deeply, disturbingly amused by their fear. The beings seemed to glow with their own phosphorescent light, making them easy targets in the darkness but apparently invulnerable to anything the family could throw at them. They moved with an eerie, fluid grace that defied the laws of physics as the Suttons understood them, sometimes walking upright like small, twisted humans, sometimes moving on all fours like animals, but always with those burning yellow eyes fixed unwaveringly on the house and its terrified occupants. As the siege continued through the long hours of darkness, the family's terror gradually gave way to a kind of desperate determination. These were hardy country people, accustomed to facing down whatever challenges the Kentucky hills might throw at them. They would not be driven from their own home by these impossible invaders, no matter how alien or terrifying they might be. The men continued their vigil at the windows, firing whenever a target presented itself, while the women gathered the children in the center of the room and tried to keep them calm with whispered prayers and gentle songs. But even their voices seemed muffled and strange in the charged atmosphere that surrounded the house, as if the very air had been altered by the presence of these other-worldly visitors. Around 11 o'clock, as the family's ammunition began to run dangerously low and their nerves had been stretched to the absolute breaking point, a decision was made. They could not endure this torment any longer. Whatever these creatures were and wherever they had come from, the Suttons had reached their limit. Gathering the children close and keeping low to avoid the windows, the entire family made a desperate run for their cars. They piled in as quickly as they could manage, engines roaring to life in the quiet night, and raced down the dark country roads toward Hopkinsville and the promise of help from the outside world. The Christian County Sheriff's Department had never received a call quite like the one that came in just after 11 o'clock that August night. 12 people, all talking at once in voices tight with terror, trying to explain that their farmhouse was under attack by creatures that could only have come from another world. The dispatcher initially thought it might be a prank call. The story was so outlandish, so completely outside the realm of normal police business, but there was something in their voices, a genuine quality of fear and desperation that couldn't be faked or performed. These weren't teenagers playing a joke or drunks spinning tall tales. These were solid, respectable country folk, and they were absolutely terrified of something that defied all rational explanation. Within minutes, police cars from city, county, and state agencies were racing through the night toward the Sutton farm, their red and blue lights cutting through the darkness. Military police from nearby Fort Campbell joined the convoy, their vehicles kicking up clouds of dust on the gravel roads that led through the rolling hills to the besieged homestead. When the small army of law enforcement officers arrived at the farm, they found a scene that challenged everything they thought they knew about the orderly world they were sworn to protect. The modest farmhouse was riddled with bullet holes, its screens torn and windows shattered by gunfire that had clearly been directed outward from inside the house. The yard around the building was churned up, as if by the feet of many small creatures engaged in some frenzied dance. Most unsettling of all were the strange, glowing patches that marked various spots throughout the property, places where the family claimed to have shot the creatures. One officer reported seeing an unusual luminescence clinging to fence posts and patches of ground, a phosphorescent glow that persisted for several minutes before gradually fading away like dying embers. Another lawman noticed that the entire area around the house was unnaturally quiet. Gone were the usual sounds that filled a Kentucky evening. No chirping crickets, no calling nightbirds, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. It was as if every living thing in the vicinity had either fled or been silenced by whatever had transpired here. They searched the property thoroughly, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they looked for any trace of the creatures the family had described. They found no bodies, no physical evidence of the beings themselves, but plenty of signs that something extraordinary and violent had occurred on this quiet farm. The bullet holes told a story of desperate defense. The disturbed earth suggested the passage of many small figures, and that persistent, otherworldly glow that seemed to linger in certain spots spoke of forces beyond their understanding or experience. After more than an hour of intensive investigation, the authorities declared the area secure and prepared to depart. The family, still shaken but grateful for the protection of so many armed officers, prepared to return to their bullet-riddled home and try to make sense of what had happened to them. But their ordeal was not yet over. In the early hours before dawn, as exhaustion finally began to claim them, and they thought perhaps they could rest, the creatures returned for one final, almost ceremonial visitation. This time, the family simply watched from their windows as the beings moved through their yard like gray shadows, given substance, appearing and disappearing among the familiar landmarks of their property with that same fluid grace they had displayed during the siege. But there was something different about this final encounter. The creatures made no attempt to approach the house, seemed content simply to observe, as if they were conducting some sort of farewell inspection of the site of their strange battle. As the first pale light of dawn began to touch the eastern horizon, painting the Kentucky hills in shades of rose and gold, the beings melted away into the morning mist like smoke dissipating on the wind. And with their departure, the natural sounds of the countryside slowly returned. Birds beginning to sing their dawn chorus, insects resuming their quiet hum, the world gradually returning to its normal rhythms. By the next day, word of the Hopkinsville Goblins had spread across the nation like wildfire. Reporters descended on the quiet farming community in droves, transforming the Sutton family's nightmare into front-page news from coast to coast. The phrase "little green men" entered the American vocabulary overnight, though those who had actually witnessed the creatures insisted they were silver gray in color, not green at all. The family found themselves thrust into an unwanted spotlight, their quiet lives suddenly subject to scrutiny from skeptics, believers, curiosity seekers, and scientists alike. They endured endless interviews, submitted to polygraph tests, and answered the same questions over and over again, never wavering in their description of what they had experienced during those terrifying hours of darkness. The explanation would come eventually, as official explanations always do. The Air Force's Project Blue Book investigators arrived, interviewed the family with the kind of professional skepticism that marked all their inquiries, and filed their report with the confident conclusion that the entire incident had been a case of mistaken identity. The creatures, they declared, had almost certainly been great horned owls whose aggressive territorial behavior and naturally glowing eyes had frightened an already nervous family into a state of mass hysteria. But those who knew the Suttons personally found this explanation woefully inadequate. These were experienced country people who had lived their entire lives in these hills, intimately familiar with every creature that called the Kentucky woods home. They knew the difference between owls and the impossible beings that had terrorized them that August night, just as they knew the difference between natural fear and the supernatural terror that had gripped them for 4 long hours. Moreover, the official explanation failed to account for numerous inconvenient details. Owls, no matter how large or aggressive, do not walk upright on 2 legs. They do not glow with their own phosphorescent light. They certainly do not shrug off shotgun blasts at close range and continue their activities as if nothing had happened. And they do not engage in coordinated group behavior that suggests intelligence and planning. The Suttons never sought profit from their experience. When reporters and curiosity seekers began tramping through their property in endless streams, disrupting their attempts to return to normal life, they began charging 50 cents admission, not to get rich, but simply to control the crowds and perhaps discourage some of the more casual gawkers. They maintained their story with unwavering consistency for the rest of their lives, never embellishing or changing details, never trying to capitalize on their brief moment of fame. Lucky Sutton lived the remainder of his days as a changed man, always keeping weapons within easy reach and never again feeling completely secure when darkness fell over the Kentucky countryside. The children who witnessed those events grew up carrying memories that would color their dreams for decades to come. Images of glowing eyes and reaching claws that would surface in quiet moments throughout their adult lives. Billy Ray Taylor eventually moved away from Kentucky, but he never stopped talking about the night he saw something fall from the sky and transform a peaceful family gathering into 4 hours of inexplicable terror. The gully where Billy Ray first observed that mysterious light still exists today, though it's now overgrown with kudzu and brambles, slowly being reclaimed by the relentless Kentucky wilderness. The farmhouse itself has long since fallen into ruin, its bullet holes and broken windows gradually surrendering to weather and time, becoming just another abandoned homestead in the rolling hills. But the story lives on, embedded deep in the folklore of Kentucky and woven into the broader tapestry of American UFO encounters. every August as the anniversary of that strange night approaches. Locals sometimes report seeing unusual lights in the area. Children on dares each other to walk past the ruins after dark, their hearts pounding as they remember the tales their grandparents told. And somewhere in the collective memory of this small Kentucky community lies the knowledge that on one summer night in 1955, something impossible visited the earth and left 12 people forever changed by the experience. The Kelly-Hopkinsville encounter stands absolutely unique in the vast catalog of UFO history, not simply for its duration or the number of witnesses involved, but for its bizarre blend of cosmic terror and almost absurdist theater. Here were beings from another world, apparently, acting out some incomprehensible cosmic joke, playing elaborate games with a family's fear, like cats tormenting mice, invulnerable to earthly weapons, but content to do nothing more than torment and observe. What they wanted, where they had come from, why they chose that particular farmhouse on that particular night, and what they hoped to accomplish through their strange siege remains as complete a mystery today as it was on that August evening nearly 70 years ago. But their visit left an indelible mark on American popular culture, giving us our enduring image of little green men and proving once again that sometimes the most extraordinary events choose to happen to the most ordinary people in the most ordinary places, when we least expect the universe to pull back the curtain and reveal its stranger, more wonderful truths. The Mantell Incident. The January sky over Kentucky hung gray and cold on the afternoon of January 7, 1948. Winter had settled deep into the rolling hills around Fort Knox, where the Army's gold repository sat protected by layers of security and the vigilant eyes of trained personnel. It was the kind of quiet Wednesday afternoon where the most excitement anyone expected was the routine passage of military aircraft overhead, their engines adding a familiar drone to the peaceful countryside. But at 1:15 in the afternoon, the phones at the Kentucky State Police began ringing with reports that would shatter that peaceful routine forever. Citizens from Maysville to Irvington were calling in, their voices tight with confusion and concern. Something was in the sky, something large, metallic, and completely unlike any aircraft they had ever seen. It hung motionless in the heavens, a circular object that gleamed with an unnatural light, neither rising nor falling, but simply existing where nothing should be able to exist. At Godman Army Airfield, just south of Fort Knox, the control tower personnel had also spotted the object. Through their binoculars and telescopes, they could see it clearly. A round, white, metallic disk that seemed to hover effortlessly at what appeared to be extremely high altitude. It was massive, dwarfing any known aircraft, and it showed no signs of conventional propulsion or navigation lights. The base commander, Colonel Guy Hicks, was summoned to the tower to observe the phenomenon himself. As he studied the object through powerful optics, his expression grew increasingly grave. This was no weather balloon, no experimental aircraft from their own inventory, and certainly no celestial body he could identify. Whatever hung in the Kentucky sky that afternoon was completely unknown. At 2:45 p.m., as reports continued flooding in from across the region, fate intervened in the form of 4 P-51 Mustang fighters from the Kentucky Air National Guard. The flight, led by Captain Thomas Mantell, was returning from a routine training mission and happened to be in the vicinity of Godman Field when the tower made contact. Flight 4427, this is Godman Tower. We have an unidentified object in sight. Can you investigate? Captain Mantell's voice crackled back through the radio, professional and calm. Roger. Godman. We'll take a look. Thomas Mantell was 25 years old, a decorated World War II veteran who had flown combat missions over Europe and earned the Distinguished Flying Cross for his service. With over 2,000 hours of flight time, he was considered one of the most skilled and reliable pilots in the Kentucky Air National Guard. If anyone could identify what was hovering in the winter sky, it would be Mantell. As his flight climbed toward the object, one of his wingmen was forced to break off due to low fuel, leaving 3 Mustangs to continue the intercept. Through his canopy, Mantell could see the object clearly now. It was enormous, perhaps 250 feet in diameter, and it possessed a metallic sheen that caught the weak afternoon sunlight in ways that seemed almost deliberate. "Godman Tower, this is 4427, Mantell radioed as his fighter continued climbing. "I have the object in sight. It appears to be metallic and tremendous in size. It's moving at about half my speed, roughly 3,000 feet above me." From the ground, observers watched through telescopes as Mantell's silver P-51 climbed steadily higher, chasing something that seemed to mock the very idea of pursuit. The object maintained its distance with apparent ease, always staying just out of reach, never quite allowing the interceptor to close the gap. At 15,000 feet, Mantell radioed again. "The object appears to be moving up and away from me. I'm still climbing. The thing looks metallic and tremendous in size." His 2 remaining wingmen, lacking oxygen equipment for high-altitude flight, made the sensible decision to break off their pursuit at 22,500 feet. They watched as Mantell's Mustang continued climbing alone, a silver speck against the gray winter sky, pursuing something that defied every law of aerodynamics they understood. "I'm going to 20,000 feet, Mantell transmitted. "If I'm no closer then, I'll abandon chase." Those were the last words anyone would hear from Captain Thomas Mantell. On the ground at Godman Field, controllers continued tracking both the UFO and Mantell's aircraft on their radar screens. They watched as his blip climbed higher and higher, apparently still in pursuit of the mysterious object. Then, around 3:18 p.m., something changed. Mantell's aircraft began descending, not in a controlled manner, but in an erratic spiral that spoke of mechanical failure or pilot incapacitation. The P-51 Mustang, that magnificent fighter that had helped win a world war, fell from the sky like a broken bird. It crashed on a farm near Franklin, Kentucky, roughly 90 miles south of Godman Field, the impact scattering wreckage across a peaceful pasture and claiming the life of one of Kentucky's finest pilots. Meanwhile, the object that had started it all continued its leisurely movement across the winter sky, apparently unaffected by the tragedy it had inadvertently caused. Witnesses on the ground reported that it maintained its position for some time after Mantell's crash, as if observing the results of the encounter, before finally accelerating upward and disappearing into the gray afternoon. The news of Captain Mantell's death spread quickly, and with it came speculation that would capture the American imagination. Here was a decorated war hero who had died pursuing what many were already calling a flying saucer. The headlines wrote themselves: "Pilot dies chasing UFO. Flying saucer claims first victim. Mystery object kills fighter pilot." The official investigation began immediately. The wreckage of Mantell's P-51 was examined thoroughly for any sign of damage that might suggest an attack from the unknown object. His watch had stopped at 3:18 p.m., the exact time of impact. The aircraft had suffered massive structural damage from the crash, but investigators found no evidence of external attack. No burn marks, no unusual metal fatigue, no signs that exotic weapons had been used against the fighter. The preliminary conclusion was that Mantell had likely lost consciousness due to oxygen deprivation at high altitude. The P-51, while an excellent fighter, was not equipped with pressurized cockpits or oxygen systems for extended high-altitude flight. At 25,000 feet or higher, a pilot could lose consciousness within minutes, and the aircraft would then enter an uncontrolled descent that would inevitably end in crash. But this rational explanation did little to satisfy a public increasingly fascinated by reports of flying saucers and government cover-ups. The Mantell Incident became a rallying cry for those who believed that extraterrestrial visitors were not only real, but potentially hostile. Here was proof, they argued, that these mysterious objects were dangerous, that they would defend themselves against earthly interceptors with deadly force. The Air Force found itself in an uncomfortable position. They needed to provide an explanation for Mantell's death that would calm public fears while acknowledging the reality of what had been observed by multiple witnesses. Their initial statement suggested that Mantell had been chasing the planet Venus, visible in the afternoon sky and possibly distorted by atmospheric conditions to appear larger and more metallic than usual. This explanation satisfied virtually no one. Venus, while indeed visible that afternoon, was nowhere near bright enough or large enough to account for the object described by multiple trained observers. Moreover, Venus doesn't move at half the speed of a pursuit aircraft or maintain a constant distance from approaching fighters. A revised explanation emerged months later. Mantell had been pursuing a classified Navy research balloon, part of the secret Skyhook program designed to conduct high-altitude atmospheric research. These balloons, made of reflective material and much larger than standard weather balloons, could indeed appear metallic and enormous when viewed from below. The problem with this explanation was that Navy records showed no Skyhook balloons in the Kentucky area on January 7, 1948. For Captain Mantell's family, the various official explanations provided little comfort. They had lost a son, a husband, a father, a man who had survived the dangers of combat over Nazi-occupied Europe, only to die in the peaceful skies over his home state, chasing something that no one could adequately explain. The incident marked a turning point in how the military approached UFO encounters. The tragic loss of Mantell demonstrated that whatever these objects were, they posed real dangers to pilots who attempted to intercept them. New protocols were established requiring oxygen equipment for high-altitude pursuits, and pilots were instructed to exercise extreme caution when dealing with unidentified aerial phenomena. Project Sign, the Air Force's first official UFO investigation program, was established just months after Mantell's death, evolving eventually into the more famous Project Blue Book. The Mantell Incident became case file number 1 in the official records, a grim reminder that the UFO mystery was not merely a matter of academic curiosity, but a potential threat to national security and pilot safety. In the years that followed, numerous witnesses would come forward with additional details about that January afternoon. Some reported seeing the object perform impossible maneuvers, sudden accelerations, right-angle turns, extended periods of motionless hovering that no conventional aircraft could duplicate. Others claimed to have observed additional objects in the vicinity, suggesting that what Mantell encountered was not a solitary phenomenon, but part of a larger pattern of activity. The town of Franklin, Kentucky, where Mantell's P-51 came to Earth, erected a small memorial to the fallen pilot. Local residents still speak of that winter day when pieces of twisted metal rained from the sky, and their quiet community became forever linked to one of the most significant UFO incidents in American history. Captain Thomas Mantell was buried with full military honors, his sacrifice officially attributed to pilot error and oxygen deprivation. But for those who knew him, who understood his skill and experience and dedication to duty, the official explanation rang hollow. They remembered a man who had faced the Luftwaffe over Europe and emerged victorious, who had logged thousands of hours in military aircraft without incident, who was not given to reckless pursuit of phantoms or mirages. In the decades since his death, Mantell has become something of a martyr figure in UFO lore. The first pilot to die in pursuit of the unknown, a modern Icarus who flew too close to mysteries beyond human understanding. His story has been retold in countless books and documentaries, analyzed by researchers and debunked by skeptics, but never fully explained to everyone's satisfaction. The object he died chasing was never definitively identified. It joined the ranks of those aerial mysteries that appear, perplex, and vanish, leaving behind only questions and the occasional tragedy to mark their passage through our skies. Every January 7th, on the anniversary of the incident, aviation enthusiasts and UFO researchers remember the young captain who gave his life in pursuit of the unknown. His sacrifice reminds us that the skies above our heads may harbor mysteries far more dangerous than we imagine, and that sometimes the price of knowledge can be measured in blood and twisted metal scattered across a Kentucky pasture. The winter sky that claimed Thomas Mantell continues to stretch endlessly above us, vast and apparently empty, but perhaps holding secrets that we are not yet ready to understand. Secrets that may demand the ultimate sacrifice from those brave enough or foolish enough to seek them out. The USS Nimitz Tic Tac encounter. The Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly in all directions on the morning of November 14, 2004, its surface painted in shades of deep blue that seemed to merge seamlessly with the horizon. 100 miles southwest of San Diego, the USS Nimitz Carrier Strike Group was conducting routine training exercises in what should have been empty international waters. The massive nuclear-powered aircraft carrier moved through the swells with the steady confidence of American naval power, surrounded by its protective screen of cruisers, destroyers, and support vessels. For the past several days, however, something had been troubling the radar operators aboard the USS Princeton, the group's guided missile cruiser responsible for air defense. Their state-of-the-art SPY-1 radar system, capable of tracking hundreds of targets simultaneously across hundreds of miles, had been detecting anomalous contacts that defied every rule of physics they understood. The objects, and there were multiple contacts, would appear at 80,000 feet, far above the ceiling of any known aircraft, then plummet toward the ocean surface in a matter of seconds. Not minutes, not the gradual descent of even the fastest military jets, but seconds. They would drop from the edge of space to sea level faster than anything in the American inventory, then hover motionlessly just above the waves before shooting back up to impossible altitudes. Senior Chief Kevin Day, the Princeton's advanced radar operator, had been tracking these impossible contacts for days. At first, he thought his equipment was malfunctioning. The targets were moving in ways that violated every principle of aerodynamics and physics he'd learned in 2 decades of naval service. But the radar was working perfectly, confirmed by multiple cross-checks and diagnostic tests. Whatever these objects were, they were real. They were there, and they were performing maneuvers that no earthly technology could replicate. On the morning of November 14th, as the Nimitz group continued its exercises under clear skies and perfect visibility, the anomalous contacts appeared once again. This time, however, the fleet was ready to respond. 2 FA-18F Super Hornets from Strike Fighter Squadron VFA-41, the Black Aces, were already airborne and available for immediate tasking. Commander David Fravor, the squadron's commanding officer, was leading the flight alongside his wingman Lieutenant Commander Jim Slate. Both were experienced naval aviators with thousands of hours in high-performance jets, trained to intercept and identify any potential threat to the carrier group. When the call came from Princeton's Combat Information Center, vectoring them toward the unknown contacts, they responded with the professional calm that marked elite military pilots. "We have multiple contacts bearing 270 60 miles out," the radar controller's voice crackled through their headsets. "Unknown altitude and classification. Proceed to investigate." As Fravor's Super Hornet streaked toward the coordinates, he expected to find the usual suspects, perhaps a foreign surveillance aircraft probing American naval defenses, or a commercial airliner that had strayed off course. What he found instead would challenge everything he thought he knew about the limits of technology and the nature of reality itself. At first, there was nothing visible in the clear morning air. The ocean stretched unbroken to the horizon, a perfect blue canvas unmarked by ships or aircraft. But as Fravor descended for a closer look at the coordinates provided by Princeton, he noticed something strange in the water below. The ocean surface was churning and frothing in a circular pattern roughly 50 feet across, as if something large was moving just beneath the waves. And hovering directly above this disturbance, perhaps 50 feet above the water's surface, was an object unlike anything in his extensive experience with military and civilian aircraft. It was white, smooth, and oblong, roughly 40 feet in length and shaped like a Tic Tac mint, if a Tic Tac could be the size of a city bus. The object had no visible wings, no engines, no control surfaces, no cockpit, nothing that would suggest how it managed to remain aloft or how it might be controlled. Its surface was perfectly smooth and uniformly white, almost luminescent in the bright Pacific sunlight. But most unsettling of all was how it moved. As Fravor watched from his position several thousand feet above, the object began to demonstrate flight characteristics that violated everything he understood about aerodynamics. It would hover motionlessly for several seconds, then dart sideways with instantaneous acceleration, changing direction without any visible means of propulsion or any apparent regard for inertia. "I'm going to go down and take a look," Fravor radioed to his wingman, pushing his Super Hornet into a descending spiral toward the mysterious craft. As he approached, the object seemed to notice his presence. It began to mirror his movements, ascending as he descended, turning as he turned, maintaining a constant distance between them like a cosmic dance partner. Then it did something that sent chills down Fravor's spine. The Tic Tac object suddenly rotated on its axis to point directly at his approaching fighter, as if acknowledging his presence with deliberate intention. For a moment, pilot and unknown craft regarded each other across a few thousand feet of empty air, two technologies separated by what seemed like centuries of advancement. Fravor decided to press his advantage, turning his $18 million fighter jet into an aggressive dive directly toward the object. In aerial combat, this would be the prelude to an attack run, a clear signal of hostile intent that any pilot would recognize. But instead of fleeing or taking defensive action, the Tic Tac did something impossible. It vanished. Not gradually, not by accelerating away at high speed, but instantly, there one moment, gone the next, as if it had simply ceased to exist. Fravor pulled out of his dive and began circling the area where it had been, searching the skies for any trace of the object. "Did you see that?" he radioed to Slate. "I saw it," came the reply, tight with disbelief. "Where did it go?" Their answer came from Princeton's radar operators. The object had reappeared on their screens 60 miles away, at the carrier group's combat air patrol point, a predetermined rendezvous location that was classified information, known only to the flight crews and combat controllers. Somehow, the Tic Tac had traveled 60 nautical miles in less than a minute, reaching a location it should have had no knowledge of. A second flight of Super Hornets was already airborne, equipped with an advanced FEL-IR, forward-looking infrared pod, capable of recording high-resolution video in multiple spectral bands. As they raced toward the new contact location, Lieutenant Commander Chad Underwood achieved a radar lock on another similar object and began recording. The resulting footage would eventually become known as the FLIR-1 video, 18 seconds of infrared imagery that showed a small, dark oval moving against high-altitude winds with no visible means of propulsion. The object maintained perfect stability despite atmospheric conditions that should have buffeted any aircraft, then accelerated off the edge of the screen at tremendous speed, leaving the Super Hornet's tracking systems far behind. Back aboard the Princeton, radar operators were tracking multiple contacts performing maneuvers that defied comprehension, objects accelerating to hypersonic speeds without sonic booms, making 90-degree turns at velocities that would tear apart any known aircraft, hovering motionlessly at altitudes where no helicopter could operate. When Fravor's flight returned to the Nimitz, the ready room fell silent as he described what he had witnessed. These were elite military aviators, men trained to remain calm under the most extreme circumstances, to identify and engage any potential threat to American forces. But what Fravor described was beyond their experience or understanding. The incident was immediately classified, buried under layers of military secrecy that would keep it hidden from public view for more than a decade. The flight crews were debriefed by intelligence officers, their testimony recorded and filed away in databases that few would ever access. The radar data was collected, the FLIR video secured, and the entire encounter officially never happened. But secrets have a way of surfacing, especially when they involve dozens of witnesses and multiple forms of recorded evidence. In 2017, the FLIR 1 video was leaked to the public, quickly followed by official acknowledgement from the Pentagon that the footage was genuine and had been recorded by Navy personnel during a legitimate military encounter with unknown objects. Commander Fravor, by then retired from active duty, began speaking publicly about his experience. In congressional testimony and media interviews, he described the Tic Tac's impossible flight characteristics with the measured professionalism of a career military officer. This was not the rambling account of a UFO enthusiast or conspiracy theorist, but the sworn testimony of a Top Gun-trained pilot with an impeccable service record. The object, Fravor stated under oath, demonstrated technology far beyond anything in the American inventory or that of any known nation. Its instantaneous acceleration, its ability to hover motionlessly without visible propulsion, its apparent immunity to atmospheric effects, and most disturbing of all, its knowledge of classified military information, suggested an intelligence and capability that originated outside human civilization. Other witnesses began coming forward as the veil of secrecy lifted. Radar operators confirmed tracking objects moving at speeds exceeding Mach 3 without sonic signatures. Electronics technicians reported equipment malfunctions coinciding with UFO sightings. Pilots from other squadrons revealed their own encounters with similar objects during the same time period. The Nimitz Incident forced a fundamental shift in how the military establishment approached the UFO phenomenon. These were no longer fringe stories told by unreliable witnesses, but documented encounters involving the most advanced sensors and the most highly trained personnel in the American military. The objects demonstrated capabilities that represented potential game-changing advantages in any future conflict. New investigative programs were established, leading eventually to the Pentagon's Unidentified Aerial Phenomena Task Force and unprecedented official acknowledgement that unknown objects were operating in restricted military airspace with apparent impunity. For the first time in decades, UFOs were being discussed seriously in the halls of Congress and the corridors of the Pentagon. The Pacific Ocean where the encounter occurred continues to host military exercises and training operations. Ships pass over the spot where something impossible once hovered above churning waters, their crews largely unaware of the mystery that briefly revealed itself in those waters nearly 2 decades ago. Commander Fravor, now a civilian, continues to speak about his experience with the measured words of a professional aviator. He makes no claims about the object's origin or the intentions of its operators. He simply describes what he witnessed, technology that exceeded human capabilities by margins that suggested either revolutionary breakthroughs in physics or the presence of non-human intelligence in our skies. The Tic Tac, whatever it was and wherever it came from, demonstrated that the boundaries between the possible and impossible are perhaps more fluid than we imagine. In the clear morning light above the Pacific, 60 miles from the nearest land, something briefly lifted the veil on mysteries that continue to challenge our understanding of the universe and our place within it. The ancient Nuremberg Sky Battle. The morning mist hung low over the cobblestone streets of Nuremberg on April 14, 1561, as the first pale light of dawn began to creep across the medieval city. The ancient towers and red-tiled roofs emerged slowly from the gray shroud, their familiar silhouettes promising another ordinary day in this prosperous German trading center. Citizens stirred in their beds, preparing for the daily routines that had governed their lives for generations, merchants organizing their wares, craftsmen preparing their workshops, farmers heading to the markets with their goods. But as the sun climbed higher and the morning light strengthened, something extraordinary began to unfold in the heavens above Nuremberg that would be remembered and debated for centuries to come. Hans Glaser was among the first to notice. The local printmaker and artist had risen early to prepare his workshop for the day's work when movement in the sky caught his attention. At first, he thought perhaps his eyes were playing tricks on him. After all, who expects to see impossible things in the familiar morning sky? But as he shaded his eyes and looked more carefully, his breath caught in his throat. The heavens were alive with objects that had no place in any earthly understanding of the natural world. Spheres of brilliant color, red, orange, blue, and black, moved across the sky in formations that seemed both purposeful and chaotic. They weren't birds, weren't clouds, weren't anything that belonged in the ordered cosmos that medieval minds could comprehend. As word spread through the narrow streets, more citizens emerged from their homes to witness the spectacle. What they saw defied every assumption about the nature of reality that their culture and religion had taught them. The sky had become a battlefield where impossible forces clashed in silent, terrifying combat. Cylindrical objects, gleaming like polished metal, moved among the spheres with deliberate precision. Some were massive, dwarfing the church spires below, while others darted between the larger forms like swift messengers carrying urgent communications. They maneuvered with a grace and speed that no earthly vessel could achieve, turning sharply, hovering motionlessly, then accelerating to tremendous velocities without any visible means of propulsion. But it was not just the individual objects that captivated and terrified the watching crowd. It was the way they interacted with each other. The spheres and cylinders seemed to be engaged in some kind of aerial warfare, pursuing each other across the morning sky, colliding and separating, forming complex patterns that suggested strategy and intent. It was as if two great armies were battling for control of the heavens themselves, using weapons and vessels beyond human imagination. The colors were unlike anything the medieval eye had ever beheld. The red spheres glowed like molten iron fresh from the forge, pulsing with an inner light that seemed to come from some unearthly source. The blue objects shimmered with the deep hue of twilight skies, while the black forms moved like shadows given substance, darker than the deepest night and somehow more solid than the surrounding air. For over an hour, the citizens of Nuremberg stood transfixed as this cosmic drama played out above their heads. Children clung to their mothers' skirts, pointing at the impossible sights with a mixture of wonder and terror. Men who had fought in earthly battles recognized the patterns of warfare in the movements above, but could not begin to understand who or what commanded these aerial armies. The sound was perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the entire encounter. Despite the apparent violence of the aerial combat, the sky remained eerily quiet. No thunder of cannon, no clash of metal on metal, no cries of battle. Just the normal sounds of morning in a medieval city while overhead. Silent forces engaged in a conflict that seemed to shake the very foundations of heaven itself. As the spectacle continued, some of the objects began to fall from the sky like burning stars. They tumbled through the air, trailing smoke and flame, crashing into the fields and forests surrounding the city with tremendous impacts that shook the ground beneath the watchers' feet. The spheres that fell glowed red-hot as they descended, leaving trails of fire across the morning sky before disappearing behind the distant tree line with sounds like distant thunder. Then, as if the cosmic battle had reached some predetermined conclusion, a new presence appeared in the sky. A massive triangular object, black as the void between stars, materialized above the city. It was enormous, larger than the great cathedral, larger than any building the citizens had ever seen. It moved with stately, deliberate purpose across the battlefield of spheres and cylinders, and its arrival seemed to signal the end of the conflict. One by one, the smaller objects began to withdraw or fade from view. Some accelerated to impossible speeds and vanished into the distance will rouse, while others simply became transparent and dissolved like morning mist touched by sunlight. The great triangle lingered for several minutes, as if surveying the aftermath of the battle. Then it too began to fade, becoming translucent before disappearing entirely from the brightening sky. As the last of the mysterious objects vanished, a profound silence fell over Nuremberg. The normal sounds of the city gradually returned. Church bells ringing the hour, merchants calling their wares, children playing in the streets. But nothing could erase what hundreds of witnesses had seen with their own eyes during that impossible hour when heaven itself had become a battlefield. Hans Glaser knew that this event needed to be recorded, preserved for future generations to contemplate and understand. As a printmaker, he possessed the skills to create a visual record of what he had witnessed. And, over the following days, he worked feverishly to capture the details of the sky battle in wood and ink. His broadsheet, when it was finally complete, showed the sky above Nuremberg filled with the objects he and his fellow citizens had observed: spheres of various colors, cylindrical forms, and the massive triangular craft that had presided over the battle's end. Surrounding the images, in the Gothic script of the time, Glaser included his account of the morning's events, describing how the heavens had been filled with objects crossing and recrossing in apparent combat. The broadsheet was distributed throughout the German states and beyond, carrying news of the Nuremberg Incident to scholars, clergy, and curious minds across Europe. Some interpreted it as a divine sign, a warning from God about impending disasters or the need for spiritual reformation. Others saw it as a portent of earthly conflicts to come, a heavenly reflection of the religious and political turmoil that would soon engulf the continent. But a few observers, particularly those with interests in natural philosophy and the movements of celestial bodies, wondered if what the people of Nuremberg had witnessed might represent something else entirely. Evidence that the cosmos contained intelligences and technologies far beyond human understanding. In the centuries that followed, Glaser's broadsheet became one of the most famous documents in the pre-modern literature of anomalous phenomena. Historians and researchers would debate its meaning, with some suggesting that the citizens of Nuremberg had witnessed unusual atmospheric optical effects, sundogs perhaps, or reflections of light through ice crystals that created the illusion of aerial combat. Others pointed to the possibility of meteor showers or cometary debris, natural phenomena that might appear strange and threatening to medieval minds unfamiliar with astronomical science. The morning mist and atmospheric conditions could have distorted these natural events, transforming them into the complex aerial ballet that Glaser recorded. Yet, the detailed nature of the account, the consistency of testimony from multiple witnesses, and the specific descriptions of objects performing coordinated maneuvers suggested something more than mere atmospheric phenomena or astronomical events. The objects moved with apparent intelligence and purpose, engaging in behaviors that seemed to indicate technology rather than natural forces. Modern UFO researchers often point to the Nuremberg incident as evidence that encounters with unknown aerial phenomena have been occurring throughout human history long before the modern era of aviation and space exploration. They note the similarities between Glaser's description and contemporary UFO reports: structured objects performing impossible maneuvers, silent flight, the ability to appear and disappear at will. The triangular craft that appeared at the end of the Nuremberg battle bears particular resemblance to modern reports of large, silent triangular UFOs observed over populated areas. Its apparent role as an overseer or commander of the smaller objects echoes patterns found in many contemporary encounters where smaller craft seem to be coordinated by larger, more imposing vehicles. Skeptics, however, maintain that the Nuremberg incident represents nothing more than the interpretation of natural phenomena through the lens of medieval world view and superstition. They argue that without modern understanding of atmospheric optics, astronomy, and weather patterns, 16th century observers would naturally interpret unusual but explicable events in terms of supernatural or divine intervention. The truth of what occurred over Nuremberg on that April morning in 1561 may never be definitively established. The witnesses are long dead. Their city has changed beyond recognition, and the sky that once hosted such wonders now carries only the familiar traffic of human aircraft and satellites. But Hans Glazer's broadsheet remains, a testament to a time when the boundary between earth and heaven seemed more permeable, when ordinary people could look up and witness events that challenged everything they thought they knew about the nature of reality. Whether what they saw was atmospheric phenomena, divine intervention, or visitation from intelligences beyond our world. The Sky Battle of Nuremberg stands as one of history's most compelling mysteries. The morning mist still rises over the ancient city on April days, and sometimes, when the light is just right and the atmosphere holds that particular quality of anticipation, one might imagine that the heavens could once again come alive with impossible wonders, reminding us that the universe holds mysteries that transcend the boundaries of time and human understanding. The mystery airship wave of 1897. The spring of 1897 arrived across the American heartland with an unusual electricity in the air, as if the very atmosphere itself was charged with anticipation of something extraordinary. From the rolling plains of Kansas to the cotton fields of Texas, from the bustling streets of Chicago to the quiet farming communities scattered across the prairie, people began to report something that should not have existed, something that challenged everything they understood about the limits of human invention and the possibilities of flight. It began quietly, as most mysteries do, with isolated reports that might have been dismissed as the imaginings of lonely farmers or the tall tales of traveling salesmen seeking attention in small-town saloons. But as the weeks progressed and spring turned towards summer, the accounts multiplied and spread like wildfire across telegraph lines and newspaper columns, painting a picture of something unprecedented moving through American skies. The object was consistently described as cigar-shaped, perhaps 150 to 200 feet in length, constructed of some kind of metallic material that gleamed in the starlight. It moved silently through the night sky, propelled by no visible means, carrying brilliant searchlights that could illuminate the ground below with an intensity that turned night into day. Those who saw it up close reported hearing the voices of human occupants, sometimes calling down greetings to the astonished observers on the ground below. In Kansas, farmers working late in their fields would pause in their labor as the great airship passed overhead, its lights casting strange shadows across newly planted corn rows. They would stand transfixed, pitchforks forgotten in their hands, as this impossible machine drifted silently through the star-filled sky, heading toward some unknown destination with the purposeful movement of human intelligence. The newspapers of the day seized upon these accounts with the enthusiasm that only a truly sensational story can generate. Editors who had grown weary of reporting on crop prices and local politics suddenly found themselves with front-page material that captured the imagination of readers across the nation. Headlines proclaimed, "Mystery Airship, Seen over Nebraska," and "Flying Machine Startles Texas Town," each new sighting adding another piece to a puzzle that grew more intriguing with each passing day. But nowhere would the mystery become more captivating or more tragic than in the small Texas town of Aurora, where the impossible would briefly touch the earth with devastating results. Aurora in 1897 was the kind of place where everyone knew their neighbors, where the biggest excitement was usually the arrival of the weekly supply wagon from Dallas, and where the future seemed as predictable as the sunrise. It was a community of farmers and merchants, people who dealt in practical realities and had little time for flights of fancy or wild speculation about impossible flying machines. Judge J.S. Proctor was tending to his morning chores on April 17th when he noticed something unusual approaching from the north. At first, it appeared to be nothing more than a distant cloud, perhaps the harbinger of a spring storm that might bring much-needed rain to the Texas countryside. But as the object drew closer, its true nature became unmistakable. The great airship that had been reported across the heartland for weeks was now approaching Aurora, flying lower than anyone had yet observed. It moved with obvious difficulty, listing to one side like a ship struggling against heavy seas, its normally smooth flight pattern replaced by erratic movements that suggested mechanical problems of some kind. As Judge Proctor and other early risers watched in fascination and growing alarm, the airship continued its troubled approach toward the town. It was clearly in distress, losing altitude steadily as it passed over the outskirts of Aurora, its lights flickering as if powered by a failing energy source. Then, the impossible became tragic. The great airship, whatever marvel of engineering or alien technology it might have been, struck the windmill behind Judge Proctor's house with tremendous force. The impact was catastrophic for both structures. The windmill collapsed in a shower of splintered wood and twisted metal, while the airship exploded in a brilliant flash that lit up the dawn sky like a premature sunrise. The explosion shattered windows throughout Aurora and sent debris raining down across several acres of Texas farmland. Pieces of twisted metal, unlike any material the local blacksmith had ever seen, were scattered among fragments of more familiar wood and iron from the destroyed windmill. But most shocking of all was what the townspeople found among the wreckage as they gathered to investigate the crash site. The body was small, perhaps 4 feet in height, and clearly not human in its proportions or features. Its skin had an unusual texture and coloration, and its skeletal structure seemed delicate, almost fragile, as if adapted for an environment quite different from the heavy atmosphere of Earth. The townspeople, practical folk that they were, examined their unusual visitor with the same methodical attention they would give to any problem requiring solution. Dr. T.J. Weems, Aurora's only physician, conducted what examination he could of the strange corpse, but found himself baffled by anatomy that followed no earthly pattern. The being's head was enlarged in proportion to its body, with features that suggested intelligence but bore no resemblance to human physiognomy. Its limbs were elongated and thin, its hands possessed of additional digits that ended in what might have been natural tools rather than simple fingers. The good Christian people of Aurora faced an unusual theological problem. Whatever this creature might have been in life, it had died in their community and deserved, they felt, the dignity of proper burial. But how does one conduct funeral services for a being that might represent the first contact between humanity and intelligence from beyond the stars? After considerable discussion, the decision was made to inter the strange visitor in Aurora's cemetery, but in an unmarked grave that would not confuse future generations or challenge the established order of things. The townspeople gathered what pieces of the airship they could find, examining the unusual materials with the curiosity of people accustomed to solving practical problems through careful observation and experimentation. The metal fragments were unlike anything they had encountered before, lighter than aluminum but stronger than steel, with a surface that seemed to shimmer and change color depending on the angle of observation. Some pieces bore markings that might have been writing, symbols that followed no earthly alphabet but possessed the purposeful arrangement that suggested language and meaning. Word of the Aurora crash spread rapidly through telegraph networks and newspaper columns, adding a tragic dimension to what had previously been merely mysterious. Here was physical proof that the airship sightings were more than mere imagination or atmospheric phenomena. Whatever these craft were, they possessed the material reality to crash, burn, and leave behind debris that could be touched and examined. But as quickly as the Aurora incident had captured public attention, it faded from the headlines as other concerns claimed priority in the national consciousness. The Spanish-American War was approaching, bringing with it issues of immediate practical importance that overshadowed mysteries in the Texas sky. The airship wave of 1897 gradually faded from public memory, remembered only in local folklore and the occasionally republished newspaper accounts. In the decades that followed, investigators and researchers would attempt to verify the details of the Aurora crash, searching for physical evidence or descendants of witnesses who might shed light on what had actually occurred. Some claimed to have located the unmarked grave, though official records of the burial were never found. Metal fragments allegedly recovered from the crash site were subjected to analysis, though the results remained inconclusive, and controversial. Skeptics argued that the entire airship wave had been nothing more than a collection of hoaxes and misidentifications, pointing out that the descriptions of the craft suggested technology far beyond anything achievable in 1897. They noted that the Wright brothers' first successful flight was still 6 years in the future, making reports of large, maneuverable aircraft seem highly implausible. The timing of the sightings, coming at a period when public fascination with invention and technological progress was at its peak, suggested to some that the airship reports were products of wishful thinking and journalistic sensationalism, rather than genuine encounters with unknown phenomena. The newspapers of the era were known for their willingness to embellish stories in pursuit of increased circulation, and a mysterious flying machine would certainly qualify as the kind of tale that would sell papers. Others pointed to the possibility that the airships represented secret experiments by unknown inventors, perhaps working in advance of the publicly acknowledged pioneers of aviation. The late 19th century was a time of rapid technological advancement, when the line between science fiction and science fact was often unclear. It was possible, they argued, that some brilliant but secretive inventor had achieved controlled flight years before the Wright brothers, conducting test flights over sparsely populated areas to avoid attracting unwanted attention. But for those who believed the witness accounts, the airship wave represented something far more significant: evidence that Earth had been visited by intelligences possessing technology centuries in advance of human capabilities. The consistent descriptions of the craft, the apparent intelligence behind their movements, and the tragic crash at Aurora suggested contact with beings from worlds beyond our own. The small town of Aurora, Texas still exists today, though it has grown little since that remarkable spring of 1897. The cemetery where the mysterious visitor was allegedly buried remains, tended by local residents who take pride in their community's unique place in the annals of American mystery. A small historical marker acknowledges the airship incident, though it carefully avoids taking any position on the reality of what may have occurred. Sometimes, on clear spring evenings when the Texas sky stretches endlessly overhead, residents of Aurora might look up and wonder if those lights moving among the stars are merely aircraft following their scheduled routes, or something more mysterious seeking to understand why one of their kind never returned from a mission to the strange blue world that circles an ordinary yellow star. The mystery airship of 1897 reminds us that the skies have always held wonders beyond our immediate understanding, and that sometimes the most extraordinary events choose to visit the most ordinary places, leaving behind questions that echo across the years like distant thunder from storms that have long since passed over the horizon. The Pascagoula abduction. The evening air hung thick and humid along the Pascagoula River on October 11, 1973, carrying the familiar scents of salt marsh and creosote from the nearby shipyard where both men earned their living. Charles Hickson, 42 years old with calloused hands and the steady demeanor of a man who'd spent his life working with metal and machinery, sat beside his 19-year-old co-worker Calvin Parker on an abandoned fishing pier that jutted into the dark water. It was the kind of peaceful Thursday evening that made you forget about tomorrow's troubles, about the welding that waited at the shipyard, about anything beyond the simple pleasure of watching your line disappear into the slow-moving current. The two men had chosen this spot well, away from the bustle of town where the only sounds were the gentle lapping of waves against wooden pilings and the distant hum of insects awakening in the Mississippi twilight. Charles had brought young Calvin here before. The older man enjoyed sharing these quiet moments with his earnest co-worker, teaching him the patience that good fishing required while they talked about work, family, and the small concerns that filled their daily lives. Tonight felt no different from any other. Two tired men seeking a few hours of peace before another day at the yards. But as they sat there in comfortable silence, their conversation drifting between the merits of different baits and the challenges of raising families on shipyard wages, something began to change in the air around them. At first it was barely noticeable. a low, whirring sound that seemed to emerge from the stillness itself, so quiet that you might mistake it for blood rushing through your ears or the distant hum of electrical transformers. Calvin looked up from his fishing rod, tilting his head to listen more carefully. The sound was growing stronger, joined now by a strange zinging noise that made the hair on their arms stand up and sent an inexplicable chill down their spines despite the warm evening air. It was the kind of sound that spoke to something primal in the human nervous system, triggering alarm bells that had been silent since childhood. Fears of things that moved in the darkness. Then they saw it. Rising above the tree line on the far side of the river came something that belonged in the realm of dreams rather than the familiar landscape of coastal Mississippi. It was oval-shaped, perhaps 30 to 40 feet across, bathed in an eerie blue light that pulsed and flickered like electricity dancing across its metallic surface. The craft moved with impossible smoothness, defying every law of physics they understood, hovering just above the ground with no visible wings, rotors, or any other means of propulsion. Charles dropped his fishing rod, the sound of it clattering against the wooden planks of the pier, somehow impossibly loud in the electrically charged air. Calvin's breathing became shallow and rapid as they watched, transfixed with the kind of paralysis that comes when the mind encounters something it cannot process or categorize. The object settled to the ground near their fishing spot, close enough that they could see the seamless construction of its hull and the way those pulsing blue lights seemed to breathe with their own mysterious rhythm. For a moment that stretched like hours, nothing happened. The craft simply rested there, in the gathering darkness, silent, except for that hypnotic whirring that seemed to vibrate not just in the air but in their bones, in their very souls. Then the impossible began in earnest. A section of the craft's side began to open, revealing an interior that glowed with the same blue radiance that surrounded the vessel. And from within that ethereal light, 3 figures began to emerge, not walking as humans walk, but floating with a grace that suggested mastery over forces beyond earthly understanding. The beings were roughly 5 feet tall, but there any resemblance to human proportions ended. Their skin was grayish and deeply wrinkled, like ancient leather that had weathered countless storms. Where faces should have been were smooth surfaces with no visible eyes, no expressions that might offer clues to their intentions or emotions. In place of noses and ears, carrot-like protrusions extended from their heads, and their arms ended in hands that terminated in claws capable of precise manipulation. Calvin's young mind, overwhelmed by the sheer impossibility of what he was witnessing, simply shut down. The 19-year-old collapsed unconscious onto the pier, his body's natural defense mechanisms protecting him from a reality too strange to process. But Charles remained painfully aware, trapped in his own paralyzed form as an unseen force held him motionless while the beings approached with movements that seemed to flow like water. Their touch, when it came, was surprisingly gentle, almost tender, as if they understood the fragility of the human form and were taking care not to cause unnecessary harm. Charles felt himself being lifted with ease that suggested technology far beyond human capabilities, carried toward the waiting craft that sat like a patient predator in the Mississippi darkness. Inside the vessel, reality seemed to bend and twist in ways that hurt to contemplate. Charles found himself in a space that appeared both impossibly large and intimately small, where surfaces curved according to geometries that existed outside normal three-dimensional understanding. The walls, if they could be called walls, seemed to pulse with their own inner light, creating patterns that suggested meaning just beyond the edge of comprehension. The beings moved around him with clinical precision, their activities suggesting scientific purpose rather than malevolent intent. And then something extraordinary appeared. A floating device that resembled a mechanical eye, scanning his body with beams of light that tingled but caused no pain. He was being examined, studied, cataloged like a specimen in some cosmic laboratory, subject to tests that utilized principles of science, centuries beyond human understanding. Throughout the ordeal, Charles remained conscious but helpless, able only to observe as these impossible creatures conducted their methodical investigation of human physiology. There was no communication in any language he could recognize, no explanation of their purpose or origin, only the systematic gathering of information by beings whose very existence challenged everything he had believed about life in the universe. And then, as suddenly and inexplicably as it had begun, the examination was complete. Charles found himself back on the familiar wooden planks of the fishing pier, Calvin stirring beside him as consciousness slowly returned to the younger man. The craft was already rising, its blue lights growing dim as it climbed into the star-filled sky and vanished among the constellations, leaving behind only the normal sounds of a Mississippi evening and two men whose lives had been forever divided into before and after. 20 minutes. That's all the time that had passed according to Charles's watch, though it felt like hours had elapsed inside that impossible space. 20 minutes during which they had traveled further from their understanding of reality than most people. Journey in a lifetime. 20 minutes that would thrust them into a world of skepticism, investigation, and endless questions they could never adequately answer. Shaking and disoriented, they drove through the empty streets of Pascagoula to the sheriff's office, knowing their story would sound like the ravings of madmen, but unable to carry the weight of what they had experienced alone. The deputies who listened to their account were understandably skeptical. Two men claiming they had been taken aboard a spacecraft by alien beings seemed like the stuff of science fiction rather than police reports. But something in their manner, in the genuine terror that still clung to them like a second skin, made the officers take notice. These weren't attention seekers spinning elaborate tales for personal gain, but working men whose obvious distress suggested something profound had shaken them to their core. In a stroke of investigative brilliance, the deputies left Charles and Calvin alone in an interview room with a hidden tape recorder running, expecting to catch them coordinating the details of their fabricated story. Instead, the recording captured two traumatized men trying to process an experience that transcended normal human understanding. "It's real, son." Charles's voice came through the speakers, heavy with emotion and conviction. "What we went through out there was real. I know how it sounds, but I know what happened to us." Calvin could be heard praying softly in the background, his young voice asking God to help them through this ordeal, to give them strength to face whatever came next. The fear in their voices was unmistakable, the kind of genuine, bone-deep terror that cannot be manufactured or performed. Within days, their story had traveled around the world, carried by wire services and television broadcasts to audiences hungry for mysteries in an age of increasing scientific understanding. The Pascagoula incident became front-page news from New York to Los Angeles, and Charles and Calvin found themselves thrust into an unwanted spotlight that would follow them for the rest of their lives. Both men submitted to polygraph examinations, the results showing they were telling the truth as they understood it. They underwent hypnosis sessions designed to recover additional details, though these revealed little beyond what they consciously remembered. Medical examinations found no physical evidence of their ordeal, but also no indication that they were lying or mentally unstable. Charles, with the resilience of a man who had faced other challenges in his life, embraced the responsibility of sharing their experience with the world. He gave interviews, appeared at conferences, and patiently answered the same questions hundreds of times, never wavering in his account of what had occurred on that October evening. Calvin, however, found the attention overwhelming. The experience had traumatized him in ways that went beyond the encounter itself. The sudden fame, the skepticism, the constant requests for interviews and appearances became a burden too heavy for his 19-year-old shoulders to bear. He withdrew from public view, carrying his secret in silence while trying to rebuild a normal life. Years passed, then decades. The media moved on to other sensations. Investigators filed their reports, and the world largely forgot about two fishermen who claimed they had been taken aboard a spacecraft. But the story refused to die completely, sustained by the consistency of the witnesses' accounts and the compelling nature of that secretly recorded conversation in the sheriff's office. In recent years, additional witnesses have emerged from the shadows of time. People who were in the area that October evening and saw strange lights over the Pascagoula River, drivers who reported unusual objects in the sky, residents who noticed disturbances in their television reception, and unexplained electrical problems coinciding with the reported abduction. Calvin Parker, shortly before his death in 2022, finally broke the decades of silence that had protected him from unwanted attention. In his book, Pascagoula, The Closest Encounter, he revealed details he had kept hidden since that traumatic night. Telepathic communication with the beings, additional memories recovered through private counseling sessions, and the profound impact the experience had on his understanding of humanity's place in the cosmos. The pier where it all happened still extends into the dark waters of the Pascagoula River, though it shows the wear of nearly 50 years of weather and neglect. On quiet evenings when the air is thick with humidity and the stars reflect in the slow-moving current, you can almost imagine what it must have been like for two ordinary men whose simple fishing trip became an encounter with the infinite mystery of existence. Local residents occasionally report seeing lights over the river that don't match any aircraft in the flight patterns. Others speak of electronic interference that coincides with unusual atmospheric conditions. Whether these are echoes of that October evening or evidence of continuing visitation, no one can say with certainty. The Pascagoula River continues to flow toward the Gulf of Mexico, carrying with it the secrets of that night when the boundary between the known and unknown became as permeable as morning mist. For those willing to listen, the water still whispers of impossible things, of beings who travel between the stars with scientific curiosity, about the small blue world where humans cast lines into dark water and dream of mysteries beyond their comprehension. The truth of what Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker experienced may never be fully understood or universally accepted, but their story endures as a testament to the possibility that we are not alone in this vast universe, and that sometimes, on quiet evenings beside peaceful waters, the cosmos reaches out to touch ordinary lives with extraordinary purpose.